Not just a tariff, a warning shot. China didn't blink, it recalibrated. And if Washington thinks this is another trade skirmish, it may have lost the war. On April 10, 2025, China imposed a 125% tariff on U.S. exports, targeting major sectors including automobiles, high-tech machinery, and semiconductor components. While this move appears retaliatory, coming just 72 hours after President Trump imposed $88 billion in tariffs on Chinese EVs and rare earth elements, it is fundamentally a strategic decoupling, not a knee-jerk response. Bloomberg analysts described this as a precision strike, suggesting the decision was economically and politically calibrated. As Wang Yong, senior advisor at Ping University, stated, Beijing is targeting high-leverage industries tied to electoral politics. These industries, worth over $36.4 billion in U.S. exports to China in 2024, are not randomly selected, but strategically chosen to disrupt politically sensitive American supply chains. This marks a shift in China's strategy, from reactive trade retaliation to proactive economic disengagement. Beijing is not simply fighting a tariff war, it is repositioning its economy away from U.S. dependencies. This decoupling was quietly signaled, but the implications are far-reaching, especially as China's moves increasingly reflect long-term insulation from U.S. financial and trade exposure. If U.S. policymakers interpret this as a trade spat, they risk underestimating the structural shift underway. The decoupling isn't loud, but it's happening, and by the time Washington reacts, it may already be too late. But China's tariff wasn't fired in isolation, it was triggered. Just 72 hours earlier, Washington lit the fuse with an $88 billion tariff strike aimed at Beijing's most strategic exports. On April 7, 2025, President Donald Trump authorized a sweeping $88 billion tariff package targeting Chinese electric vehicles and rare earth minerals. The announcement marked one of the largest unilateral tariff actions since the early stages of the US-China trade war under his first term. But this time, Beijing didn't respond with a mirror move, it shifted the entire board. The sectors targeted, EVs and rare earths, are not just trade goods, they are the backbone of next-generation technologies. Rare earth minerals are essential to manufacturing everything from batteries and wind turbines to fighter jets. China currently controls over 60% of global rare earth processing capacity, Reuters 2024. By targeting these sectors, Washington is weaponizing supply chain pressure, but doing so at significant geopolitical cost. The escalation sent an immediate signal: the US is not backing down. But what followed, China's 125% retaliatory tariff and subsequent structural decoupling measures, shows that this isn't just a tit-for-tat. It's a strategic realignment. As reported by Bloomberg, this round of tariffs triggered alarm among U.S. exporters and allies alike. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce warned the move could amplify global supply chain instability at a time of fragile recovery. The focus on rare earths also heightens concerns over America's technological dependency, especially in defense and clean energy. Bottom line, the $88 billion figure is more than a number. It's the spark that may have ignited a systemic trade rupture, not just a trade fight. But Beijing didn't just hit back, it went for the pressure points. By targeting America's most politically sensitive industries, China turned economic retaliation into strategic disruption. China's response to the $88 billion US tariff package was not generic, it was surgical. According to Wang Yong, a senior advisor at Ping University, Beijing deliberately aimed at high-leverage industries tied to electoral politics. This included automobiles, high-tech machinery, and semiconductors, which together contributed over $36.4 billion in U.S. exports to China in 2024, according to U.S. Commerce Department data. The precision of China's targeting reveals a deeper play: economic pain with political consequence. These sectors aren't just economically vital, they're located in swing states like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, which will be pivotal in the 2026 midterms and 2028 presidential elections. As a result, this tariff wasn't just about GDP, it was about the ballot box. Tesla halted shipments to China. Deere & Co. lost $2.1 billion in market value in just 2 days. And soy futures dropped 4.3% on fears of broader retaliation. China didn't just answer a trade blow, it repositioned the fight into the political arena. This form of retaliation also avoids brute force confrontation. As Bloomberg notes, the move was calibrated to maximally disrupt without triggering an all-out economic war. By weaponizing supply chain pressure in politically charged sectors, Beijing gains asymmetric influence without escalating militarily or diplomatically. In essence, China is playing the long game. It's not simply retaliating, it's strategically destabilizing America's domestic consensus on trade. But this wasn't just economic pressure, it was a signal. Beneath the headlines, Beijing was quietly laying the groundwork for a deeper departure, cutting ties not just with US goods, but with the dollar itself. China's retaliation went far beyond tariffs. While media coverage focused on the 125% levy, the real pivot was structural and financial. According to China's State Administration of Foreign Exchange, Beijing slashed its U.S. Treasury holdings to $668.6 billion in Q1 2025, the lowest level in 15 years. But this wasn't a standalone move. It was part of a systematic financial decoupling from U.S. institutions and currency exposure. Two of China's largest state banks, China Construction Bank and ICBC, have reportedly halted all new dollar-denominated loan issuances for state-owned projects. Instead, financing is being rerouted through renminbi, RMB, and euro-backed instruments, effectively demoting the dollar from its default role in Chinese sovereign and quasi-sovereign credit. Reuters confirmed this pivot as part of a larger internal insulation strategy designed to reduce vulnerability to US sanctions. This marks a shift from risk hedging to proactive disengagement, and the intent is unmistakable. China is engineering financial autonomy, not in rhetoric, but in practice. Goldman Sachs Asia economist Maggie Wei noted that this policy aims to preempt future financial sanctions by reducing dollar-linked liabilities. That is not a hedge, it's a warning. China is not waiting for the next move from Washington. It is moving first to neutralize US financial leverage. The significance is global. The dollar is more than a currency, it's a geopolitical instrument. If Beijing's exit strategy scales, it could reshape the architecture of cross-border finance. But Beijing wasn't just insulating internally, it was reprogramming externally. By redefining US goods as no longer commercially viable, China quietly rewrote the rules of global disengagement. On April 11, 2025, China's Ministry of Commerce used a telling phrase in its policy update. Certain US imports were now considered no longer commercially viable. While seemingly bureaucratic, this classification was anything but benign. It was a regulatory pivot with strategic disengagement embedded in technocratic language. According to Henry Gao, trade law expert at Singapore Management University, this phrasing functions as a legal shield. By labeling US goods as economically inefficient rather than politically undesirable, China is circumventing WTO scrutiny while simultaneously giving domestic firms regulatory cover to SEVA contracts with American suppliers. In effect, China is building a firewall, not just against future tariffs, but against dependence. The shift signals preemptive contract termination, allowing Chinese companies to exit commercial ties before Washington even notices. Case in point, BYD cancelled a $500 million sensor supply deal with a US firm just days after the ministry's announcement. The timing wasn't coincidental, it was coordinated, systemic, and compliant. This tactic signals a broader strategy, market-based decoupling masked as economic rationality. It's not loud, but it's legally airtight, and it sets a precedent other economies could follow when reorienting trade away from the US. This wasn't just tactical insulation, it was strategic foresight. Beijing isn't reacting to sanctions, it's preparing for them. And the first step is rewriting its financial DNA. What we're witnessing is not improvisation, it's intentional design. As part of its broader financial decoupling, China is preemptively shedding exposure to dollar-linked liabilities to mitigate future sanction risks. According to Goldman Sachs Asia economist Maggie Wei, China is no longer merely hedging, it is engineering a controlled retreat from US-centric financial systems. This shift is central to what Beijing calls its internal insulation strategy. It marks a decisive move from risk management to structural repositioning. By cutting reliance on dollar-based loans, treasury assets, and SWIFT-cleared transactions, China is reducing its vulnerability to any future weaponization of the US financial system. This is not hypothetical. Since 2022, the US has increasingly used financial sanctions as tools of statecraft, with over 640 Chinese entities currently under restrictions as of April 2025, US Treasury records. Beijing's response: build alternative infrastructure before the next escalation. By pivoting to yuan and euro-backed financing and instructing state banks to do the same, China is creating an insulated economic core, one that doesn't rely on US liquidity, payment rails, or reserve instruments. This is not a defensive crouch, it's an assertive restructuring. Beijing understands that the dollar is a choke point, and it's designing a system where that choke point no longer exists. Beijing's real mastery lies in semantics. By redefining trade disengagement as economic inefficiency, China isn't just avoiding conflict, it's gaming the rules-based system itself. On April 11, 2025, China's Ministry of Commerce declared that certain US imports were now deemed no longer commercially viable. While this phrasing appears technical, its implications are far-reaching. Rather than citing political motivations, Beijing is reframing trade disengagement as a matter of economic logic, a move that effectively shields it from WTO-based retaliation. This is what Henry Gao, trade law analyst at Singapore Management University, described as a regulatory green light for disengagement. By shifting the justification from ideology to inefficiency, China is using neutral policy language to pursue strategic goals. Practically speaking, this approach allows Chinese firms to terminate contracts with American suppliers without triggering international legal disputes. It also creates legal cover for systemic divestment, enabling the state to direct a large-scale withdrawal from US trade dependencies while maintaining formal WTO compliance. This strategy is not only defensive, it's legally anticipatory. It creates a framework that future partners, regulators, and international bodies must navigate without clear violations. It also gives Beijing a narrative advantage, framing its retreat as market-driven, not retaliatory. In essence, China is rewriting the optics of decoupling. The disengagement is real, but it's been wrapped in language designed to neutralize legal and diplomatic pushback. Beijing doesn't need loud exits. Behind closed doors, contracts are being cancelled, quietly, systemically, and without a single press release. The disengagement from US trade is no longer just a government policy. It is now being operationalized at the corporate level and in silence. Chinese firms are terminating contracts with US partners without public statements, regulatory fanfare, or media coverage. The clearest example came just days after China's Ministry of Commerce framed US imports as no longer commercially viable. BYD, one of China's largest EV manufacturers, abruptly cancelled a $500 million sensor supply deal with a US company. There was no announcement, no dispute, just a clean break. This kind of maneuver reflects Beijing's systemic signaling. It empowers firms to act unilaterally under the guise of market logic, while still being fully aligned with state strategy. According to trade analysts, this approach serves two purposes: minimize diplomatic friction and accelerate economic decoupling under a veneer of commercial neutrality. The danger for the USA: these quiet terminations are undetectable until they accumulate into real economic impact. By the time they show up in export data or earnings calls, the structural damage is already done. This phase of decoupling is the most difficult to counter, not because it's aggressive, but because it's invisible. And while US firms are being edged out, America's allies aren't exactly holding the line either. Some are quietly pivoting toward Beijing. Invisible. Amid rising US-China tensions, a quiet shift is underway among Washington's key allies. While the White House pushes for strategic decoupling from Beijing, some of its closest partners are moving in the opposite direction, closer to China. In March 2025, Germany's BASF, one of the world's largest chemical producers, signed a €7.2 billion expansion deal in Guangdong province, marking its largest investment outside Europe. This move directly contradicts US pressure on European firms to de-risk their exposure to China. At the same time, Saudi Arabia completed a landmark crude oil transaction with China's Sinopec, settled entirely in digital yuan, the first major energy deal bypassing the US dollar. This transaction isn't just financial, it's monetary diplomacy, and it signals a growing willingness among non-Western powers to challenge the dollar's dominance. These decisions weren't made in a vacuum. According to the Financial Times, France is lobbying for a BRICS EU observer platform, and Brazil is pushing for interoperability between China's SIPs and Latin American payment systems. Together, these moves reflect the emergence of a multipolar trade order, where US trade policy is no longer the default framework. Washington's diplomatic leverage is being tested, not just by rivals, but by its own network. As Citi strategist David Lubin warns, if allies stop treating US trade policy as their own, how long until China isn't the one on the outside? And these aren't isolated shifts. When US allies start moving trade policy off script, it's not just diplomatic, it's systemic. The global financial order is no longer singular. The global financial architecture is undergoing a paradigm shift. What was once a US-anchored system is fragmenting into a multipolar network as countries reassess the risks of overdependence on Washington, economically, politically, and monetarily. David Lubin, strategist at Citi, put it plainly: a multipolar trading order is emerging, and Washington is no longer the default center. That statement reflects growing alignment among economies pursuing alternatives to US-centric norms, from payment systems to trade settlement currencies. The shift is visible across multiple fronts: France lobbying for a BRICS EU observer platform, Brazil seeking SIPs interoperability across Latin America, and energy exporters like Saudi Arabia bypassing the dollar altogether. More tellingly, US sanctions, once the most potent weapon in Washington's arsenal, are losing effectiveness. As of April 2025, over 640 Chinese entities have been sanctioned, yet China's trade with ASEAN rose 7.4% year-over-year. The system is adapting around the pressure, not collapsing under it. The implication is stark. The post-Bretton Woods architecture is no longer stable. The rise of regional blocs, alternative currencies, and non-dollar clearing platforms marks a historic transition from unipolarity to fragmentation. This isn't the end of the dollar, but it may be the end of automatic dominance. The dollar isn't gone, but it's being challenged in ways the West never prepared for. And as China carves new paths in trade, tech, and currency, one question remains. Will the US adapt or be sidelined? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more global market insights.